Remember that time the Utah Jazz were supposed to get Dejounte Murray at the trade deadline? Or at least they put in a bid for him and they almost seemed to have him? Well, recent details suggest that we could have had him. We just weren't willing to give up what they were asking for. Today we're going to explore that just a little bit. I'll make it as short and concise as possible. So to help me get more content out and to be supportive of the channel, go ahead and smash that like button now and subscribe if you like NBA news. With that being said, let's go ahead and hop into this one. So obviously last year at the trade deadline, they ended up selling out a lot of their players, 3 of them in total, with 2 of them going off to the Toronto Raptors and Fontecchio being individually sent down to the Detroit Pistons where he's flourished since. However, they were hoping to be able to buy and sell the trade deadline, but they just weren't able to buy the correct pieces. A lot of people thought that they were going to go after Mikal Bridges until the Nets suggested that they would end up building around him this offseason. How they're going to build around him when I don't see him being a number 1 option on the championship team, I don't know. But they suggest that they could. So that was off the table. And so the next piece ended up being Dejounte Murray for the Jazz. And a lot of people felt like they were going to be able to make a pretty reasonable offer because aside from the Jazz, the only team that has more draft capital and just ability to move things around is probably the Oklahoma City Thunder. And we saw how their playoff stint went, even without having him, but they didn't even need him because they have Shai Gilgeous-Alexander. With that in mind, the Jazz were known to have made an offer for him at the deadline, and because the Hawks were 50-50 on keeping him, they decided that they didn't like what was on the table, and apparently there was a little bit of an adjustment that was requested that they quite simply weren't willing to surrender. We found out recently in an article on SLC Dunk by James Hansen, he ended up citing particularly Ben Anderson on KSL, particularly on the part of the Jazz Notes podcast, where he says, and I quote, "I will tell you there was some talk about Dejounte Murray to the Jazz at the trade deadline and it was going to cost the Jazz Keyonte George and the Jazz said no." As much as Keyonte George has shown his flashes and everything, I'm not quite sure he will end up being the point guard that is probably better than Dejounte Murray. And that's not a knock on his game. Remember, in college, he played the small forward spot and he actually bulked up to as much as almost 230, 235 and had to shrink down to the 185 he's listed at on the official roster right now, which means he didn't get to play the point guard position. And starting out in the NBA, he wasn't at the point guard position either until really after the trade deadline when he got most of his reps and we really got to see a strong sample size of what he was capable of. There was quite a few highs, for example, when he ended up dropping 9 threes against the Warriors in that second time we faced them, but there were a lot of lows, like that first game when we played against them and he was getting absolutely fried by Stephen Curry, or just the multiple games where he shot in the low 30s from the field and also low 30s, low 20s from three-point range. Not exactly the greatest standpoint for him overall from the season, but we saw enough flashes to feel comfortable and confident in what he can potentially do in the future. That said, I don't think that defensively he will end up being a lock. And that is my biggest concern because Dejounte Murray, remember, made an all-defensive team before when he was with the Spurs. He was also regarded as one of the best guard defenders and more specifically point guard defenders alongside his ability to naturally pass the ball really well and also score pretty decently. He's not a terrific shooter, and Keyonte may end up surpassing him in that standard more than anything, I suppose. And I think when he gets more of a feel for the point guard position and just doing things in the system with the Utah Jazz, I think he could be a pretty good passer. But that defensive bit is kind of what has me itching a little bit at the collar because I was kind of hoping to have Dejounte Murray on this roster. He's not too terribly old, and he doesn't necessarily perfectly fit the timeline, but he fits it pretty solid enough to be a pretty big boost. Now, one thing that could also be potentially important is the fact that maybe it wasn't just Keyonte George that they didn't want to give up, but perhaps a couple other role players that in totality seem like a little bit too much of an offer to go ahead and put on the table for the Atlanta Hawks. The Hawks will likely end up selling either Trae Young or Dejounte Murray this offseason. At least that's what analysts are suggesting. And I would like to get a little bit in on those sweepstakes as the time comes. But there will be a significant period of time that will allow for more clarity to come about. And I hope, for all of our sakes, that Danny Ainge was right in not putting down Keyonte George into that deal to get Dejounte Murray, and instead Keyonte George this offseason and over the subsequent seasons ends up becoming a notable piece and one of the great young stars in the league. One important thing that we are going to have to keep in mind is that Keyonte George didn't play that point guard spot earlier on, and so he has a lot of room to grow. Admittedly, he shot in the 30s both from the field and from three-point range, so I'm not the highest on his overall shooting splits, but he did have a couple games where he shot really darn well. Defensively, he did show growth. Remember when I said that he got fried against the Golden State Warriors, and that's probably like his coming into the NBA, the welcome to the NBA rookie type moment. The second game, he played a lot better. He was a lot more consistent when it came to fighting over screens. He communicated better. He was more aggressive on that side of the ball, and he didn't look as winded. And mind you, I believe there was only one game in between those, or if that, it was in the same 5-day period in which those matchups were seen. So he's been known to be a gym rat. He's been known to be somebody that enjoys watching film and focusing in on what needs to be understood. So that's a very good thing that bodes well for his overall post-career after college, being with the Utah Jazz, and hopefully he can end up becoming that star that everybody hopes he can be. And I know that a lot of fans don't particularly enjoy the growing pains, considering we just came from the Rudy Gobert and Donovan Mitchell era, and both of them individually were successful with the Cleveland Cavaliers and the Minnesota Timberwolves in their own rights. But there is something to be said about the success that Keyonte George could bring to the table, but it will ultimately take a little bit of a longer leash to allow him the opportunity to really grow into that mold. I believe that Taylor Hendricks could end up being honestly the best person in the draft that we selected, and I think that if he grows up into that possible defensive prowess heavy having individual who's already a great help side defender but just needs to learn a little bit more, I think that they can offset their skill sets very well. And I think if Keyonte George can up his passing, he can utilize the three-point shooting that Taylor Hendricks has. And alongside Bryce Sensabaugh, who's going to be a sneaky piece off of the bench in my eyes, I think that we have a really good thing cooking up in Salt Lake City. But you guys let me know what you think in the comments below. As always, I'm interested to see your opinion. And like I requested, go ahead and smash that like button, subscribe, and turn on post notifications if you're into NBA content or if you like the Utah Jazz, because that is my emphasis on this channel, though I do try to touch on different teams in total. Also, go ahead and drop a couple of topics that you'd like me to cover in future videos. I'm always down to listen, and if you're a member, you get the videos faster than anybody else. With that being said, good morning, good evening, and good night, no matter where you're on the globe watching. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.